Chapter 9. Uncle William had sold my horse. It was rather an ugly discovery, me standing there in front of an empty stall, and Edgar the groom having the unlucky task of telling me. It was all Edgar could do to look me in the eye after he had broken the news about Spin. Spin, a sleek chestnut with white socks, had been given to me on my 13th birthday, and had survived the fire with only a minor burn on her left flank. Mother had thought her too big for a girl, but Father knew that I could bring her to step. She had a silken mouth that would turn with the least touch when I was in the saddle, and she could outrun all but Sir John Roberts' top 2 hunters. I turned away to rub my nose because it was tingling hard. After a few deep breaths, I stiffened my jaw and said as lightly as I could, "Saddle the gelding for me. I'm going on a ride." "Old Mac?" I nodded. "Use Father's saddle." Mounted atop Old Mac, I made my way down the drive in a slow, deliberate manner that might have been comical had my errand not been so serious. I had hardly reached the gate when I saw Lawrence and Tory Burnsides trotting in my direction. Tory was Lawrence's best friend. They'd been tight as lice since they'd both discovered the joy of torturing cats and children. We met on the road, and Lawrence rested his hands on the pommel of his saddle and smiled at me. "You look absolutely ridiculous on that thing. Where can you be going?" "Out," I said shortly. Tory reached over and caught Old Mac's bridle. "You can't go now, Lisbette, not when I've ridden over especially to welcome you home." I groaned inwardly, cursing my luck. "Sorry, Tory," I said. "I've an errand to run in the village. I know you'll understand." "On this old workhorse?" Tory said. "Why don't you let me take you in my new carriage? I can leave now and be back with it before you ever make it to town on this old nag." It was like this every summer when I came home because Tory was forever at our house. He was as bad at teasing as Lawrence, only harder to look at. Tory's skin was scarred from the pox, and Jane called him lizard face behind his back. But even if he'd had perfect skin, he still wouldn't have been handsome. His eyes were too close together, and his chin too broad, and his nostrils were stained yellow from taking too much snuff. But the worst part was how he would follow me through the house, insisting that he was favoring me with his company. "Better not keep her, Tory," Lawrence said, stopping to spit over the stone wall. "She looks like a woman set on business." Tory adjusted his hat with the end of his whip. "Which is why I'd better escort her, don't you think? Now come, Lisbette. You know you want to see my new carriage. I went all the way to Michaelton to buy it. It's the fastest thing in Easton, I'll wager." "You do realize," I said, "that I've been driving around in plush, climate-controlled vehicles that travel 5 times the speed of your dowdy old carriage, even if it is brand new, which I doubt, because everyone knows you haven't the money to buy anything but used." Tory pressed his hand to his heart in mock pain. "Do you hear, Lawrence? She doubts me. Can it be that she hasn't heard the news?" He turned a proud face to me. "My grandfather finally keeled over and has left me all his money. Now you can't pretend that doesn't interest you." I didn't even try to hide my disgust. "Honestly, Tory, can't you try being decent for once in your life?" I kicked Old Mac's flanks. "I'm leaving." But Tory was quick to position his horse in front of me. "Fine. But afterwards I'm going to drive you to the lake, and we'll row out to the island for a picnic. You'll pack something nice, won't you?" "Sorry," I said in mock mournfulness. "I'm betrothed. The terms of my contract don't allow for pairing off with anyone but Timothy Easton." "Uh-huh," he said, shaking his head happily. "Timothy's as good as a wanted felon now. That voids the contract, which means you are a free agent." I lowered my chin and glared at him. Timothy is innocent until proven guilty. "Whatever Timothy's done, if he's brought the King's Guard down all the way to Easton, it's big. Believe me, Timothy's finished. And even if by some small chance he isn't, there's no way he's going to show hide nor hair before the end of the week as long as these soldiers are around. The contract is as good as done, which means," he stopped to smile in a smug, self-gratifying way, "that Miss Blackwood is finally free to pair off with other, more interesting men such as myself. Besides, you never fooled anyone into believing that you were in love with that stick-in-the-mud Timothy anyway. The last time I saw you two together in the same room, you did everything you could to keep as far away from him as possible. And what's more, he did the same thing. Tory, why don't you go to the lake, get in that boat you were talking about, row out to the deepest part, and jump in. Oh, and take Lawrence with you. He needs a bath." Lawrence clicked his tongue. "Always quick with the jokes, aren't you, cousin dear? One day you might not be laughing anymore. One day soon, maybe." I didn't bother to respond. Luckily, I had managed to offend Tory to the point where he moved out of the way so that I could pass. My exit on Old Mac might not have been as dramatic as I would have liked, but at least no one tried to stop me again until I reached the bridge. The village of Easton was a quarter-mile beyond the gates of Brindlelock. Its boundaries were marked by the Daub River. It seemed unbelievable that this sleepy channel was in any way related to the same notorious river that I had seen crashing and creaming down the mountains 3 days ago. There it had been an icy torrent. Here, it was more like Old Mac, as mellow and smooth as milk toast. Top River had a tendency to get fat along the banks in the spring. Every year it flooded over the banks and made a bog that was both inconvenient and treacherous. The bulk of the flooding was done with now, leaving mud so thick that it could trap a full-grown bull. Every child in Easton was taught to stay away from the river banks this time of year, because the wetlands were deadly. It never failed that some farmer lost a pig or a cow to the deadly quagmire that turned to quicksand for the unwary wayfarer. The conditions only lasted a week or so, and then the mud was gone. Gone, I mused, as I hoped these soldiers would be before my birthday. These were my thoughts as I approached the bridge leading into town and saw the 2 sentries blocking my way. I was already annoyed enough after my encounter with Lawrence and Torrey. But the sight of these foreigners standing to block my way into my own village was more than I could stand. If I'd been on spin, I'd have taken the bridge at a gallop, leaving the 2 soldiers in a cloud of choking dust. Instead, I had to endure the galling experience of a painfully slow approach, giving the 2 soldiers plenty of time to ogle me before I ever even reached the bridge. One of them grinningly raised his hand for me to halt. Frowning, I stopped and looked down at him. "Yes." "What's your business in the village today?" he asked in a strong Western accent. "And what business is it of yours to know?" I asked. My irritability had no effect on him. "What's your name, honey?" "Sally Tightlip," I answered curtly. But the reference to the old nursery rhyme went right over his head, and he said, "Sally's a pretty name." "Isn't it? And now will you please let me pass? We're looking for a fugitive." "Do you think I'm carrying one in my pocket?" "Have you seen Tim Easton at all in the last day or so?" "Never heard of him." He laid his hand on old Mac and smoothed the broad gray neck. "Do you expect me to believe that you live in Easton and you don't know Sir John Roberts' oldest son?" "Oh, you mean Mr. Timothy Easton. Why didn't you say so?" Timothy, it's the same name." I glanced at his name badge sewn to the front of his uniform. "Baldwin." "Well, Mr. Baldwin, then you won't mind if I call you Bald." His smile disappeared. "That's Sergeant Baldwin to you." "Are you sure it's not Sergeant Bald? Because I think it might be the same thing." He put his hands on his hips. "What is your business in the village?" Deciding I was wasting time arguing, I answered bluntly, "I have no business. I'm on the way to see a relative." He held up a paper with Timothy and Richard's photos. "Have you seen either Timothy Easton or Richard Blunt?" I shrugged carelessly. "No." "If you do, you're to report it to the sheriff or any member of the King's Guard. You're free to pass." I heard his companion snicker as I went by, saying, "Sergeant Bald." Easton was not what one would call a bustling place, but today an unusual number of people were walking the streets, mingling about doorways. Obviously, curiosity had overcome the need to work. Visitors were rare sights in these parts. Soldiers from the West were a true anomaly, and there were enough soldiers here in Easton today to keep the mildest of busybodies occupied. Even for me it was a strange sight, seeing Western uniforms in Easton Village. They stood out like red paint on snow. I wanted them to go away. This wasn't Michaelton, and we didn't like strangers. They were nothing more than intruders who had no respect for our ways. Furthermore, it was obvious that most of them had never been this deep into the country, because they were staring at us just as much as we were staring at them. My own perch high on old Mac's back made me all the more conspicuous. One soldier had the gall to wink at me. I stopped my horse. "I'm sorry, did you just wink at me?" He stepped forward. "Well, that's how we say hello out west. Don't worry, kid, it only means you're sweet." We were standing outside the blacksmith's shop. The place belonged to Jerome Smith, as it had his father and grandfather. By the look of his yard, business was booming for Jerome just now, what with all the horses that had been brought in for the soldiers' use. There were several soldiers lingering outside the shop, waiting for Jerome to service them. Jerome, however, must have heard our little conversation, because in the corner of my eye I saw him coming out of his darkened shop with a hammer in his hands. "Is that fellow bothering you, Miss Blackwood?" Jerome wasn't the tallest man in the village, but there was no one stronger for miles around. For the past 16 years, he had won the annual wrestling match without so much as breaking a sweat. I turned to Jerome and said, "I believe he was trying to teach me some of his charming Western customs." "I'd be happy to show him one or two of ours." I couldn't help smiling triumphantly at the soldier. We may not have modern technology in Easton, but we have better things. Loyalty and fidelity, to name two. The soldier backed off and muttered to his friend, "Whatever happened to Eastern hospitality?"